Imagine spending 27 years in prison and walking out without hate in your heart. This is the story of Nelson Mandela, a man who changed a nation by choosing forgiveness over revenge. But before he became a global symbol of peace, he was just a boy growing up in a small village in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was born in 1918 in a village called Mavezo, surrounded by rivers, hills, and traditional life. His birth name was Rolihlahla, a word that meant troublemaker, and in many ways that name would shape his future. When Nelson was only 9 years old, his father died. The loss changed his life forever. He was taken to live with a local regent, a powerful leader who became his guardian. There, Mandela watched how leaders listened to their people before making decisions. This lesson stayed with him for life. At school, a teacher gave him an English name, Nelson. It was a common practice in those days. As he grew older, Nelson began to notice something unfair about the world around him. In South Africa, the color of your skin decided where you could live, work, and even walk. This system was called apartheid. Mandela later attended Fort Hare University, one of the few places where black students could receive higher education at that time. But his time there did not last long. Nelson joined a student protest and was expelled for refusing to follow the rules. Facing an arranged marriage, Nelson made a bold decision. He ran away to Johannesburg, the biggest city in South Africa. Johannesburg was loud, crowded, full of opportunity, but it was also full of injustice. Mandela worked different jobs during the day and studied law at night, determined to build a better future. In Johannesburg, Nelson met people who were already fighting against apartheid. Their ideas changed his life forever. In 1944, Nelson Mandela joined the African National Congress, an organization that fought for equal rights. Mandela and other young activists believed the ANC was moving too slowly, so they created the ANC Youth League to push for stronger action. Mandela became one of the first black lawyers in Johannesburg and opened a law firm to help people who suffered under apartheid laws. Every day, Mandela saw families separated, workers arrested, and entire communities destroyed by apartheid policies. In 1952, Mandela helped organize the Defiance Campaign, a mass protest where thousands of people peacefully broke apartheid laws. Protesters were arrested in huge numbers, but they continued to resist without violence. Mandela's speeches inspired thousands, and he quickly became one of the most recognized faces of the anti-apartheid movement. In 1955, activists created the Freedom Charter, a document that declared South Africa belonged to all its people, black and white. The government responded by arresting Mandela and 155 other activists, accusing them of treason. The treason trial lasted 5 long years. Mandela lived under constant pressure, not knowing what the future would bring. In 1960, police opened fire on peaceful protesters in Sharpeville. 69 people were killed. The world was shocked. After Sharpeville, Mandela began to believe that peaceful protest alone was no longer enough. In 1961, Mandela helped create Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. Mandela went underground, moving from place to place in disguise. People began calling him the Black Pimpernel. In 1962, after months of hiding, Nelson Mandela was finally captured by police on a lonely road outside Johannesburg. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but the worst was still to come. In 1963, police raided a secret ANC hideout in Rivonia and discovered documents linking Mandela to sabotage plans. Mandela and his comrades were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The punishment could be death. The Rivonia trial became one of the most famous trials in modern history. The world watched closely. During the trial, Mandela gave a speech that lasted more than 4 hours. His final words would echo across the world. He ended his speech by saying he was prepared to die for the ideal of a free and equal society. Instead of execution, Mandela and his fellow activists were sentenced to life imprisonment. In 1964, Nelson Mandela was taken to Robben Island, a prison surrounded by cold ocean waters. He was 46 years old when he entered the prison gates. He would not walk free again for 27 years. Mandela's cell on Robben Island was small and bare. He slept on a thin mat on the cold concrete floor. Every day, prisoners were forced to work in a limestone quarry under the burning sun. The bright white stone reflected sunlight into their eyes, damaging Mandela's eyesight permanently. Even in prison, apartheid continued. Black prisoners received less food and worse conditions than others. But Mandela refused to let prison destroy his spirit. He encouraged other prisoners to study, debate, and learn. Robben Island became known as Mandela University. Mandela treated the prison guards with respect, believing that even enemies could change. He learned Afrikaans, the language of the government, so he could better understand and communicate with his captors.
The government offered Mandela freedom many times, but only if he agreed to stop fighting against apartheid. Mandela refused every offer. He said he would only accept freedom when his people were free as well. While Nelson Mandela remained behind prison walls, the world outside was slowly beginning to change. People across the globe were learning about his story, and many of them were shocked by the injustice he had endured. In cities like London, New York, and Paris, thousands of people marched through the streets, holding signs that read, "Free Nelson Mandela." Students, workers, artists, and political leaders joined the growing movement against apartheid. Governments also began to take action. Many countries introduced economic sanctions against South Africa, refusing to trade with the apartheid regime. These sanctions placed heavy pressure on the South African economy and increased international isolation. Inside prison, Mandela was growing older, but his spirit remained strong. After spending 18 long years on Robben Island, he was transferred to another prison on the mainland where conditions were slightly better. By the late 1980s, it was clear that apartheid could not survive much longer. The country was facing economic crisis, political unrest, and growing international condemnation. In 1989, a new president, F.W. de Klerk, came to power. Unlike his predecessors, he understood that the system had to change if South Africa was to avoid disaster. Secret meetings began between Mandela and government officials. These discussions were risky and delicate, but they marked the beginning of a new chapter in South African history. Finally, the government made a historic decision. After 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela would be released. On February 11, 1990, the prison gates opened, and Mandela walked out into the sunlight, holding the hand of his wife, Winnie. He was 71 years old, but he stood tall and walked with calm dignity. Outside the prison, thousands of people had gathered to welcome him. They cheered, cried, and sang as they saw the man who had become a symbol of hope and resistance. Just hours after his release, Mandela addressed a massive crowd in Cape Town. In his speech, he thanked the people for their support, but made one thing clear: the struggle for freedom was not over yet. After his release, Nelson Mandela returned to a country that was still deeply divided. Years of apartheid had created fear, anger, and mistrust between communities. Mandela understood that the future of South Africa depended on peace, not revenge. He began working with President F.W. de Klerk to negotiate the end of apartheid and build a democratic nation. The negotiations were difficult and dangerous. Violence continued in many parts of the country, and some groups tried to stop the peace process by force. At times, it seemed as if South Africa might fall into civil war. Despite the danger, Mandela traveled across the country, speaking to people in cities and villages. He encouraged them to stay calm and to believe that a peaceful future was possible. In 1993, the world recognized these efforts. Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in ending apartheid. The following year, South Africa prepared for its first democratic election. For the first time in the country's history, citizens of all races were allowed to vote. On Election Day in April 1994, millions of people stood in long lines outside polling stations. Some had waited their entire lives for this moment. The African National Congress won the election, and Nelson Mandela was chosen as the first black president of South Africa. On May 10, 1994, Mandela stood before a cheering crowd and took the oath of office. It was not just his victory, it was a victory for all South Africans who had dreamed of freedom. As president, Mandela chose a path of reconciliation. Instead of punishing his former enemies, he worked to unite a broken nation and build a future based on equality and respect. His leadership showed the world that forgiveness can be stronger than hatred, and that true power lies in the ability to bring people together. As president, Nelson Mandela faced enormous challenges. South Africa was free, but it was still struggling with poverty, inequality, and the deep wounds left by decades of apartheid. Mandela understood that political freedom alone was not enough. The country needed healing, and people needed to confront the painful truth about the past. To achieve this, Mandela created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This special body allowed victims of apartheid violence to tell their stories in public, while those who had committed crimes could confess in exchange for possible amnesty. The hearings were often emotional and heartbreaking. Families spoke about loved ones who had disappeared, been tortured, or killed during the years of oppression. Mandela believed that hearing the truth was the only way for the nation to move forward without falling into a cycle of revenge. In 1999, after serving just one term as president, Mandela made another historic decision. He stepped down from power voluntarily, even though he was still one of the most popular leaders in the country. His peaceful transfer of power became a powerful example of democratic leadership and inspired many nations around the world. Even after leaving office, Mandela did not disappear from public life. He continued to travel, give speeches, and support humanitarian causes, using his voice to speak for those who could not be heard. One of the causes closest to his heart was the fight against HIV and AIDS, a disease that was affecting millions of people across Africa. Mandela helped raise awareness and encourage governments to take stronger action. In his later years, Mandela gradually withdrew from the public spotlight and spent more time with his family and loved ones. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. Leaders and ordinary people from around the world paid tribute to the man who had helped change the course of history. Although he was gone, Mandela's legacy lived on in the democratic South Africa he helped build, and in the millions of people who continued to be inspired by his courage, humility, and forgiveness. After Nelson Mandela's death, tributes came from every corner of the world. Presidents, kings, and ordinary people spoke about the impact he had on their lives and on history itself. In South Africa, thousands gathered in stadiums, streets, and public squares to celebrate the life of the man they lovingly called Madiba. People sang, cried, and shared stories of how Mandela had inspired them. He was laid to rest in the village where he had been born, surrounded by the same hills and landscapes that had shaped his childhood. It was a quiet and symbolic return to his roots. Nelson Mandela left behind more than political change. He left behind a powerful example of how courage, patience, and forgiveness can transform a nation. Around the world, students continue to read about his life in schools and universities. His story is used to teach future generations about justice, leadership, and human dignity. Mandela once said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." These words became one of his most famous quotes, and his life proved just how true they were. His journey reminds us that even in the darkest times, hope and determination can lead to extraordinary change. From a young boy in a rural village to a prisoner on a remote island, and finally, to the president of his nation. Nelson Mandela lived a life that few could have imagined. His story continues to inspire people to stand up against injustice, to forgive when it is easier to hate, and to believe that a better future is always possible. If you found this story meaningful and inspiring, consider subscribing to this channel for more real stories that help you improve your English while learning about remarkable people from history.